It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the second part of the session. Philip, when he introduced Chuck, said that he promised he wouldn't embarrass Chuck by telling stories about him. I certainly am not going to say anything that will embarrass Judith, because I'm more worried that she will tell stories about me. So Judy Aberg, as you can see, is Dean for Systems Operation for Clinical Sciences, the George Baehr Professor of Medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and Chief of Infectious Diseases at Mount Sinai. I've known Judy for longer than both of us would care to say, but Judy came first to Washington University as a fellow in infectious diseases, and after completing her fellowship, had a brief period of time at UCSF, and we managed to recruit her back to the faculty at Washington University, and where she started her leadership development as a national leader in HIV clinical research and HIV clinical trials. She moved to NYU to lead their HIV program in the mid-2000s, became chief of infectious diseases at NYU, and then crossed Manhattan to become chief of ID at Mount Sinai and chief for the system as Mount Sinai developed from a single academic medical center into an academic medical system. Given her one of her roles has been to help that system develop a clinical and translational research enterprise across the system. I thought it would be very pertinent to have Judy tell us a little bit about some of the experiences they've had, and we can talk then in our panel discussion about how we might think about them at our institution. Judy.
Thank you, Bill. And it always feels like I'm coming back home. I actually took the Metro link in from the airport, and I was amazed that so many things look the same until I hit here, where there's just buildings and constructions everywhere. So, but thank you all very much for this invitation. My talk is going to be a little bit more on the practical side, thinking about how do you operationalize, how do you open up clinical trials across the health system. These are my disclosures, and in blue is the ones the studies had closed, but now actually Pfizer has a new vaccine coming out soon, and we'll be doing that study starting up in this summer. So I'm going to discuss how to operationalize and facilitate the conduct of clinical trials across a health system, to discuss advantages of centralizing versus decentralizing processes, and then some lessons learned from my own experience with some barriers and solutions that we've been able to come up with. So just as a way of a little bit of background, I was recruited to Sinai in 2014 with the goal to open HIV-related clinical trials at 6 sites across Manhattan. This is the time that Sinai merged with several community hospitals, and so this was a very exciting time for me because they had at least 10,000 patients with HIV in their system altogether, so a really great opportunity at the time. And right after I got there, we underwent inspections by NIH Pharmaceutical Affairs Branch and the Division of AIDS to see if we could serve as a site for this trial Reprieve, which was an NIH-sponsored randomized trial to prevent vascular events in HIV, and half of the sites were AIDS Clinical Trials Group sites, and with my move, I no longer was an ACTG site, so I had to go through all these approvals. And I established a study coordinator and found a site leader for each site, and we successfully enrolled 256 across the sites, plus 53 in a very intensive mechanistic sub-study. And I could have probably enrolled much more, but we were really limited at that time by our staff. And just a little bit of a sidebar, but on April 11th, the Data Safety Monitoring Board closed the Reprieve trial because they did in fact find that daily statin reduced major adverse cardiovascular events in people with HIV who did not have a clinical indication to be on a statin. In fact, their AS-CVD risk score was less than 5, so pretty remarkable findings of a 35% reduction. This is the infrastructure I built at the time, and it's a little bit of a hybrid model where you can see here on this right side where I centralized so that all regulatory data management, all laboratory was done at the main campus at Mount Sinai Hospital. And then what we did is we had all these sites where an identified PI and co-investigators assigned a study nurse, as well as we were able to use the pharmacies at each of those sites, which was a big plus because never before had they done, investigational drug studies, especially when 2 of these sites here were independent sites. They were just clinical, they were, essentially HIV clinics in the community. So really surprisingly went well. We wound up merging these 2 sites together for financial reasons. So why was Reprieve a success? We had NIH funding and support, had a lot of school support. We had skilled research staff and identified clinical research site leaders. The investigational pharmacy was awesome. The person that was the director of it had lots of experience with NIH networks, and she taught all the pharmacists at these other places where they had never done this before. And we were already QA certified to process lab samples, and we have a really outstanding cardiology research imaging center. And then COVID came along. So prior to that, no other group had gone system-wide like I had with the HIV clinical trials. So we used the infrastructure of the Clinical and Translational Research Center to roll out trials. But we didn't roll them out in the outer boroughs. And obviously, it's very multifactorial why this happened, but you can see that there was much higher morbidity and mortality out in the outer boroughs than there was in the city. And this really prompted us to look at this and say, we need to do clinical trials, and hence wound up being offered the position as a dean to really think about how we could roll out clinical trials system-wide in order to recruit a more diverse population, but the ultimate goal was to reduce health disparities. And so other things that we took from what we did with COVID was, one, we had formed an oversight committee, and I believe you may have done something similar here, where we had individuals from different disciplines together. We had the support from the CTSA of their Office of Research Services. And then the COVID CTU initially was great because people weren't working right, so we were able to deploy all the clinical coordinators from the Cancer Center as well as the Medicine Clinical Trials Office. Well, all those people went away when they got redeployed and went back to their own jobs. So I had to hire individuals so that we could maintain what we already had built system-wide. And again, I want to thank the IRB because trying to do this again across multiple sites with all these different trials, we really did have to go to a single IRB. And it's ultimately now, this is the process that we use for the COVID clinical trials, but we're now going to roll this out in the Department of Medicine so that every study then would have a submission, get reviewed scientifically, but not only just scientifically, but for resource allocation. So we can make sure that when you open a trial, it's going to be successful. I think all of us had had the experience that you open a trial and guess what? No one enrolled, right? So that's a lot of loss, time for the grants office and everybody to open a trial that doesn't successfully enroll. Also can monitor your accrual so that you can see what type of population, and if we see that it's predominantly one population over the other, is to give a heads up to the investigator that they need to really start thinking about the individuals they want to target. And then you have the whole host of all the other things that we can help with, budget and finance and regulatory, et cetera. And just giving you an idea, this is one snapshot at the time. We opened over 40 trials. We had PIs from multiple disciplines, but this was all coordinated with a lot of help through the CTSA. And in the end, these were our emerging priorities, was that what did we learn? So there was a lot of patient-centered methods, right? So finally doing electronic consents, having telehealth visits. You could use other ways of getting sample collection, like dried blood spots. You could do home sample collection. We were very fortunate that at Mount Sinai, we had through what we call executive services, that there was this medic group that was available, that they would go to people's houses to get their blood collection, right? So this was for the kind of the VIPs, board of trustees, et cetera. And we expanded that during COVID, and this I felt bad for this guy because he, originally had like, one team, and then, with COVID, he had to expand, but it really worked well. And then wearables. At Mount Sinai, we developed something called the Warrior Watch, which started with the nurses all wearing this Apple Watch that would do a survey of symptoms and monitor their vital signs, so that we actually were able to show that we could predict when they were going to get COVID. So things like that. And in the end, what did we find? There were a lot of benefits to this, because now you're really focused on the participant, right? So there's less burden to the participant. They weren't coming in, we were going to them. So that really improves your compliance or adherence into a protocol. It boosted our enrollment. It kept a better retention that way. And overall, we really did see an increase in diversity and inclusion. So now thinking about, all right, what are the operational considerations? Because now, as we heard, COVID's over, right? And pretty much is, right? If we look at the numbers, the hospitalizations are down, the deaths are down, it's no longer a public health emergency. So what do we do now? Because I have a large COVID clinical trials unit who's now going to morph into a system clinical trials unit. And so what things do we need to think about? So currently there is a clinical research unit through the CTSA and the Office of Research Services, and they have some outpatient space. In fact, it's where we use our old biocontainment unit for when Ebola was a threat in 2014. There is temporary specimen storage. They have nursing support and nurse practitioners. You have investigational drug services, and they can do a lot of monitoring. And because it's a biocontainment unit, you have telemetry and other things available. But I think one of the really important things that the CTSA does is gives us support, especially for junior faculty, to help you ramp up. And how do you open a clinical trial? How do you create those order sets? What equipment do you need, et cetera? So some really hands-on training and assistance to get them up and running. And then we purchased Encore, which is a clinical trials management system. And we actually purchased this before COVID, and then COVID hit and it kind of fell to the wayside. And then in 2022, with the support from the CTSA and the school, we built a central team to support CTMS. And I don't know if you have a similar system here, but you can track your projects in real time, and you can manage all your protocols, documents in one place. I think for me as an investigator, one of the best things is really about billing and financials, because I think one of the things that happens in clinical trials, many times for industry-sponsored trials, they pay you for what you're entering into electronic data capture, but there's all these invoiceable items that sometimes get overlooked, and CTMS will capture that, so you won't be missing those. Now, this is a big problem in New York. It may not be a problem so much at WashU, but research space is a premium in New York City. So one of the ideas is, and many do, is you have it co-located in your clinic, right? Which is very convenient because your patients are coming in and they can go right into a trial. But that means you're tied up in a room, and that delays other patients from being seen. Not all the services that you need from a research aspect are available. You could have billing conflicts. You have to be cautious about what's research versus standard of care. Your staffing may be more costly. For us, the hospital employees are union-based. Not all the school employees are. And then support for FTEs. If you only have 1 or 2 trials, do you really have enough funding that you can support full-time coordinators, et cetera? So having a centralized model is where you can share those costs and resources. You pay for when you need them. So you build your budget by your schedule of evaluations, and you're only paying us for when those times that you're going to need us. It reduces the billing conflicts because you're in a separate area. You're also scheduling according to the schedule of evaluations of the protocol, which then is more predictable, and then none is out of the window. Whereas if you're going to try to schedule them within your clinic, you might be out a window. You have skilled research staffing, and we'll offset some of that regulatory and data burden that the investigator has. And then there's the potential for us to help them with satellites to increase enrollment. So you need a responsible PI, and the question is who can be your co-Is? And one of the things that happened to us in 2022 was Janssen Pharmaceuticals all of a sudden said that advanced practice providers could no longer do certain tasks. And so that meant the PI or other MD-DO investigators had to take over those functions. But I call this the San Francisco General model here is about using study physicians for centralized processes, because all junior faculty can use salary support. In fact, some senior faculty can use salary support. And it helps with career development, right, starting in. And when I first went to UCSF at San Francisco General, I had funding through the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, but I also had funding through this independent clinical trials. It gives you 10-20% support, but you're also being mentored by more senior investigators, and you get that to learn how to do trials for the rest of the team. Your clinical staffing needs really depends on what types of studies are you opening. Are you opening phase 1 trials, which are very more intensive, or is it predominantly phase 2, 3? Are they ambulatory inpatient? How many program managers are you going to need? And should you have one program manager that oversees, the whole project? Who administers your meds? If you have IV, IM, or oral? And something that came up during COVID, and again, hadn't seen before, is that the placebos didn't match the active drug. So you had to have double staffing. You needed blinded staff and you needed unblinded staff. And then who could serve as your coordinators versus your research nurses. So every project, you have to look at your feasibility of what your enrollment's going to be, but what type of staffing do you need? And are there specialty exams or procedures that your staffing needs to be trained on? And as I mentioned before, home health. So is it worthwhile to have it all internal and create your own system? And same like home infusion, should you have the model that belongs to your institution, or should you go with an external vendor? And non-clinical staffing needs, again, similar. I'm just going to point out, again, that there's so many functions here that you can share, right? So, by having, your front desk schedulers, having couriers. The courier can take multiple study labs, and they go to the pharmacy and pick up multiple drugs. So, being able to cost share these things may make sense for a centralized process. Again, it depends on how your institution runs these things, but in the same like regulatory, for the most part, the regulatory specialists, they have all the expertise in the IRB, so why not share that rather than everyone getting their own person to build their own consents? And then, the use of a central IRB. I was very fortunate with Reprieve. It was 2015, and it was a little bit before the government really moved towards using a central IRB, but I was able to use that on Reprieve, which really made a huge difference. And, in 2016, the NIH had released new guidance, and Francis Collins really believed that by having a single IRB, that we would increase the efficiency of these multiple studies. It would reduce the time to study initiation. You'd have consistency of your ethics review, help alleviate some of the burdens that the institutions had on doing this, and ultimately would reduce research costs. And you can get into arguments on sometimes how well central IRBs work versus your own, but that's where you need to look at every project and say, is this one for an institutional IRB, or is this better that we go to a central IRB? And then one of the big things as you think about with these mergers, are you all under the same reliance agreement? For us, 6 of our hospitals were, but South NASA was not. So, one of the things I started doing was a study with hyperimmune globulin for prevention of COVID, and we realized that, South NASA didn't have the same IRB, and then we wound up with all these drug issues. So, so those are the things that come up that sometimes you don't think about until right when you're there, and then there's some kind of stop point. So really need to think about these things. I want to spend a little bit of time on investigational pharmacy because this really is a key core group for all of us doing clinical trials. I am not in favor of the times where we have some independent practitioners that will store the drugs in their own cabinets, and that's always a little sketchy to me on temperature monitoring and things like that, and just compliance. And so I think it really helps whether you have it in one unit or you have multiple IDSs throughout your institution. But they will do the monitoring visits. They're there for the inspections and provide the adequate and appropriate space for the drugs. At Sinai, we have over 1,500 open trials, and 483 right now are active. And you say, well, why aren't the others? That's my point earlier about people open trials and then they never enroll. The other is that some of these, some of the practitioners do, in fact, don't use the investigational drug services because they store the drugs in their own facility. We estimate that about a third of the active studies by next year and the year following should be conducted at multiple campuses throughout. So we're now at that stage of really opening up and doing, you might want to call them satellites, but having multiple sites participating in the studies. I just want to give you an example. This is one of our freestanding oncology centers in Chelsea. They have approximately 61 cancer-related active studies now. And there were huge space problems, and so you can see here, this is when we first built it here, and there was an inconsistent process for obtaining study drug. Some of the companies are willing to ship to each site that you have open. Others want you to ship them to one location, and then it's up to us to ship it to wherever it's going. And then again, you have to be cautious about temperature monitoring. This is really tricky with oncology, that where you're mixing in hoods and then to do that transport. And believe me, it's not easy going from Mount Sinai Hospital, that's more in the upper Manhattan, versus going downtown like where Chelsea is. I mean, this could take you an easy hour and a half by car. So lots of issues with that. So we did these SWOT analysis, and this is, again, in the investigational drug services, because we wanted every single component that we're looking at in research, we are doing a SWOT. And I think you can appreciate here, I won't go into great depths, but the weaknesses here that we said, we don't have consistent processes across these 7 hospitals. A lot of our pharmacists have limited to no research experience, and there is no way to really predict what that volume was. So how do you even staff up the pharmacy? So these are the things that we're really taking a hard look at and really addressing now and trying to rectify. In the meantime, we have this hybrid model. This does not have South NASA on it, but it has 2 locations downtown. And everybody can dispense and randomize and return and destroy and then the documentation. The centralized functions vary, but we're really trying our best so that we can work with every company that they will deliver directly to the site. And that might mean 7 different pharmacy deliveries, but we don't want it all coming centrally and then us being responsible to ship it to the site. And we can do this with one contract, one IRB. On the IRB, you could just list all the sites and who the PIs are. And I think this process works really well. Unfortunately, not all the companies agree. And I did find it ironic that the NIH was able to do this seamlessly before any of the companies could, but now they're starting to catch on. So, and then laboratory costs. So what is standard of care versus research, and who determines this? Is there somebody in finance that's doing this? Is it the laboratory that's doing it? is the PI doing it? And then if you are going to be co-located, how do you split costs between what's standard of care versus what's research related? And Epic IT can create billing templates, and for the most part works well. I still wind up, though, with an occasional patient that gets a bill, and then you have to sort that out. And then again, it's something that you can share would be the central lab processing and shipping. The only problem with that, I will say now for this, is that many times I want all the lab techs to do all the training, so you got to think about how many trials they actually can train on. So what we did was a needs assessment, and this was in collaboration with the Institute for Transformative Clinical Trials. And when I first received this deanship, what I did is I met with every hospital president and chief medical officer and said, what are your highest priorities? And they gave me a list, and then I pretty much took the top 3 to 5, and then I met with the chiefs and chairs of those departments and divisions to see what they wanted to do. And then with the Institute, we started doing this, that we started doing surveys that we gave to all the department chairs to look at what trials they had and what were their resources that they had. We provide consultations for trial design and conduct. We started having seminars now for clinical trial best practices. And we have monthly meetings where we review trials in depth. And it's all different, again, all different departments, divisions, as well as infrastructure. And this is the questions that we ask in advance of those monthly meetings for the presenters to answer for us. So how many trials are being conducted in your area of expertise? What are important areas of clinical trial activity? What's your funding profile? Is it industry or federal? Are your trials being conducted within health system hospitals? And do you have any multi-center trials for which you serve as a coordinating center? And what's your vision over the next 5 years? And what are the bottlenecks? And our dean attends every one of these meetings. It's really been kind of exciting. It gives an opportunity for the faculty to present some of the research they're doing, as well as answer these questions, but he hears directly where the gaps are and what we really need to address. And what have we learned so far? We learned that the departments really was a lot of variation. Some only had 7 trials ongoing, others had more than 250. For the most part, we were largely supported by industry, which you can imagine a dean does not want to hear. They prefer the NIH funding. But there was an opportunity then, right? And people, sharing and having all these people in these meetings, realizing, oh yeah, coordinating centers really could generate a lot of income and provide more expertise. And most of the trials were at Mount Sinai Hospital, not at the health system. And we're like, you're missing, outstanding populations and populations in need that would benefit from participating in your trials. And so we identified multiple opportunities for infrastructure improvement, looked at what each department had, their own individual clinical research units or clinical trials offices. Like I said, we're rolling out the CTMS for them. We needed dedicated clinical trial space, and I'm really pleased because we were just given space on the west side, 5,000 square feet, to build one of these centralized models, as well as another space that's in our big ambulatory center downtown. And we just need to continue with the training and oversight, so we're really ramping up what we do for especially helping junior investigators so that they can be successful as they open trials. And so some of our accomplishments was, again, offering that expertise to help launch these high-impact clinical trials, providing design expertise, the master platform trials. We did several of them now during COVID-19. Expertise on the design of decentralized trials and these wearable digital tools like Warrior Watch, and being able to do e-consent through Epic or other means. This Hawthorne effect may not be what you think. This is actually the name of a company that does home visits and really has expanded the number of services that they offer. And we've been able now to expand trials to all our hospitals within our system. And in fact, we recently launched several trials at South NASA. And again, we're capturing very diverse populations by doing this. I wanted to bring this up because this was really surprising to me when I saw this slide just recently when we had our CTSA external advisory group. And, you know, so the head of our IT contacted Epic to ask about the various features that are available. So of 418 that had adopted these features, you can see the percent of those that have actually implemented these different things. And I didn't know these things could be done in Epic either. And so, you know, this is raising awareness now. So we're letting everybody know, hey, did you know we can do this under Epic? So you can do your research encounters in Epic. You can do your billing there. They actually associate the research studies with study protocols in oncology now, so that when you have a regular visit, you know, whatever your schedule of evaluations is right there in Epic. And then these other features, this is only 169 have Epic features already enabled. And you might call this My Chart. We call it My Mount Sinai. And again, this is something new that we're doing. What we've been doing, we're part of the Recover Network, which is looking at long COVID. And so, you know, everybody that tests positive for SARS-CoV-2 at Mount Sinai, they, in our laboratory, automatically triggers to the My Mount Sinai about our registry that we're doing for Recover, so that they can enroll. And, you know, it's been very successful. In fact, one of my colleagues in Cleveland on a call said, you just beat us out, because how are you enrolling all these people? And it's because of this rollout through Epic. And so there's a lot of things that you can do for recruitment. So you can really look into Epic and say you want to recruit everybody with asthma that's of a certain age and certain stage, or on an inhaler. And so you can do that cut, and they will get, you know, through my Mount Sinai, they will get an invitation, and it just says, are you interested in clinical trials on asthma? And then they click yes, and then it goes to the next phase. And each time it just gets more in depth, and then, you know, you now have somebody that you may even be able to do some of these studies via e-consent, and they don't even have to come in. So it depends what it is. And then finally, what this really did was it led to more people applying to be coordinating centers. And again, really pleased to show how many different departments now serve as coordinating centers for various NIH programs. And all of this would not be possible without having a really core team. And I can never thank my group enough, but you can see that we're a very diverse group of individuals who are dedicated to going out to the community. So community engagement is key. This one individual, Debbie Lucy, is my program manager. She is always thinking novel things. So the other week she went on a sisters ride, which is, there's a sisters bus, which is a group of African American women who go for a lobster fest in Connecticut, and that's near the outlet malls. And so when she got on the bus, she then stood up and said, hey, we're getting ready to do a shingles vaccine study. Who's over the age of 50? And half the bus raised their hand. And I will tell you that we now have several interested people that we're screening. So, you know, it's just really novel things that she's come up with. So I want to thank you all again for this kind invitation, and look forward to our questions. Thank you.
Judith, if you want to take. So if I could invite our panelists down, I'd like to welcome them all. We have Zhang, who's an assistant dean for clinical research, and really is the clinical director for our Center for Clinical Studies and for Clinical Research at the Siteman Cancer Center.
Hi, Bettina.
Bettina Drake, as Judy just mentioned, the role of community engagement is critical. Bettina is professor of surgery and associate director for community outreach and engagement for the Siteman Cancer Center. And Ginger Nicol is associate professor of psychiatry, and Ginger is the director of our mobile health research core at the CTSA, as well as an active researcher in clinical research and clinical trials in the Department of Psychiatry. And actually, as you were talking, all of the things that you mentioned are things that we've been discussing. And we have some of these in progress. So I'm going to start just to engage our panelists, and then Judy, you can give us some comments. But as we did with the first session, we really would welcome participation from the audience, questions from the audience. There will be microphones available, and we'd love to hear what you're thinking. I'll start this way, and because one of the things that was really novel very early on in the COVID epidemic was led from our Department of Psychiatry, a study that really was entirely remote. And one of the first times certainly we had ever done, and one of the first in the country that was entirely remote. And I'm just wondering, Ginger, if you could, having heard Judy's comments, if you could reflect on what you think mobile health and remote technology will actually bring to the clinical research arena.
Well, thanks. That's a great question. And thanks for your talk. I feel like I learned a lot. It's nice to know that there are others that are innovating in this space, and helping to integrate technology is a way to keep clinical trials in an academic space and really high quality. So I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in terms of, technology is constantly changing, and especially now. Every time you turn around, there's a new app or a different technology or some way of measuring something. And so it can be hard to stay on top of those developments. You really have to have dedicated resources for that. And so I was sort of curious to hear how you had engaged technology in all the different ways that you have. But one of the places where I feel like we have more to do and could really make a contribution would be in making our measures more precise. So imaging across multi-site studies, for example, and using mobile technology to try and standardize that way. Another thing that's been sort of interesting here, especially in psychiatry, is, as Bill mentioned, we had an opportunity to do a fully remote study with fluvoxamine and COVID. And so that was a very interesting process. There were a lot of boots on the ground, so it wasn't all technology mediated. There was a lot of training and coordinating that still needed to happen. And over time, especially as vaccines came out and testing got more precise, that there wasn't as much of an interest in the community, and recruitment kind of changed. So I'm curious to know, how do you keep up with the technology? Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have. And then how can we leverage this amazing infrastructure that we have as part of the CTSA to standardize across academic centers?
Yeah, I think especially talking about imaging is very difficult. I mean, we have used like a mammogram. We have a mobile unit. And so for oncology, they've been able to have their mobile unit go out to other communities and offer. Then when the individuals are there, you can consent them and do that. But you're right. I mean, with the imaging is hard because people have to come back in if you're talking about radiographic imaging. Dermatology, on the other hand, has been very successful with photos, and people sending in pictures of for psoriasis or vitiligo, where they're doing clinical trials. The individuals don't have to come back in. They can show their skin through a telehealth visit. So there are some things. I would say one of the things that we often forget about is that not everybody has cell phones. Not everybody has access to computers. So you have to be really careful, because you could have a lack of equity within your, different neighborhoods. So like for the clinical trials, I will say that most of the industry sponsors have been really supportive of us when we ask for cell phones. And that is part of the contract, so that we can give them that, so they can do those surveys too, right? You have to do your diary of what you're eating, or if you took your medication. And so being able to offer a cell phone is a huge plus. The other is the way that reimbursement is now as well. We use ClinCards internally, which, can be just used like any MasterCard or whatever, that you can go and you get it instantly loaded when you have your visit. Some of the companies now are using a system called Scout, and there's a lot of mistrust about something like that. You have to give them, your banking information. Well, guess what? A lot of poor people don't have bank accounts. What do you do about people that are not documented? They don't have social security numbers. So these systems actually can cause a problem, and in fact, some trials they can't enroll in because they don't have it. So, we do have, you're right, we have a lot of different technology and a lot of different systems, some for the best, but others are a little bit more challenging. With your fluvoxamine study, we were going to be a site, and we couldn't be a site because of the way the drugs were dispensed, right? Because it was that you were enrolling individuals, consenting them, and the drugs were coming from I don't know where to them. And New York State was like, you can't do something like that. So I think we you want to be innovative and creative about ways that we can recruit these more diverse populations, but we got to think about what's available for them and what we're able to bring to the community.
So expanding on that theme, Bettina, the Cancer Center has been working for a long time on enabling trust around clinical research and more recently clinical trials. As we expand beyond cancer, do you have reflections on things that investigators need to think about if they haven't been starting in a new area or a new clinical trial, and they really want to address diversity in their patient enrollment?
So that's definitely something we've been doing a lot of within the Cancer Center in trying to increase diversity within clinical trials, not just among minority populations, but rural populations as well that have to travel long distances in order to get specialized treatment or care here in the St. Louis area. So I think just starting with being open and providing education and the conversation, taking the time to explain what the study is, I think is kind of like baseline level of what we can do. I think also providing opportunities for individuals to choose where they receive care. I think sometimes when you have an individual who receives their care at a satellite site, sometimes they are required to switch physicians and come to the main site in order to enroll in a clinical trial. And so they've already built trust with the physicians that they're seeing, and to have to switch physicians sometimes to enroll in a trial can be difficult, and then they have to go through that process of building trust again, and something that patients going through cancer or any other type of chronic disease treatment may not be willing to do. So thinking about the mobile health and other options, if there are things that within a clinical trial can be conducted at the satellite site or at a rural primary care clinic site, whether the samples are being collected or tests run, and that data can be shared within the clinical trial, understanding there are lots of protocols in place on how samples need to be collected. But if there's any leniency in that and allowing them to be collected close to home, primary care providers can still have an close interaction with the patients while they're participating in the clinical trial, could also go a long way towards building trust.
Judy touched on something that I think we've been talking a lot about, which is the necessity for ongoing training. And I wonder, again, putting it into the context of expanding from a very successful Cancer Center program here to a wider system program where we can expand what we're doing in clinical trials. Do you want to just comment on what you think that where the training gaps are, where the opportunities might be?
Sure.
Push it up.
Sorry. Okay. All right. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Bill. I was very intrigued by your talk, and I think especially, given how you have moved the medical school or academic-led clinical trials throughout the 7 hospitals in this health system is really, I think, a remarkable achievement. I think one of the issues, as Bill said, is the the recruiting, onboarding, training of a professional research staff and workforce. I think that here at WashU, we've been working very hard in the last 5 years to try to standardize our job descriptions, create a more robust career ladder. And as COVID swept through the globe, we lost a lot of professional research staff to CROs and pharmaceutical industries,
Yep.
and in particular, Scout, believe it or not. So I have a lot more to say about that. Anyhow, but I think that as a response to that, we looked at our job descriptions and really recently starting to work with our CTSA and the Cancer Center together to look at what kind of competency-based promotional track we can provide as career development for our staff. Again, to enable us to have a more professional clinical research staff who would be ready and able to launch new technology and to be trained to engage with community to promote recruitment of more diverse population. And to that, I'll also add that as we also grapple with our health system, this is kind of going back to the previous talk. I think Clay said, our health system tend to be top down and as well as perhaps risk averse. I'm diverging a little bit, Bill.
That's okay.
So I think I would be really interested to hear how you have made a case to the Mount Sinai health system to use one single IRB, for example, for all of your clinical trials, as well as how have you worked to allow your research staff to work in hospitals to recruit study participants and conduct procedures there.
Yeah, so, not everything's rosy, So it's taken a lot. The single IRB actually started when I first came to Sinai because of Reprieve. And so, I no longer was an AIDS clinical trials group site, and I was opening all these trials and, doing the reliance agreements and thinking about this as getting Mount Sinai IRB to do this was Francis Collins had just given a talk on the importance of a single IRB and that the NIH was moving that direction. So I presented to a whole group, not just for the IRB, but other leaders about why we should follow this model. And I think this was going to be, again, a proof of concept. Can I really do this, that I can open at 6 different sites across the system, have one contract, one IRB, and how much easier that would be than, trying to do this for each site independently, because each one was going to have then one, they couldn't put all the sites onto one IRB. So I just looked out with timing and things like that. Going forward, we've struggled with this a lot. I will tell you that scientists at Sinai developed this new COVID vaccine from using a Newcastle disease virus as the vector. And because it is something that was developed in the microbiology labs there, the conflict of interest committee said, you shouldn't use our own IRB because they may have a bias about any adverse events. And so that was the first time that we've now had a phase 1 trial that was not institutional. But I think that's why you need to make a case for each one trials that you're doing, because for industry, it certainly does make sense. Multi-center trials, everybody's doing the same thing, and it's a lot of work burden. And so I think it's some of that when you're talking to leadership is about costs, right, and efficiency. So if you can reduce some of their workload, and it's these platform studies that are very well watched and observed, I think that gives more confidence to the IRB. Whereas if it's an investigator-initiated, you really don't want to be going to an external IRB, I don't think anyway, except in the situation like I just explained, where there could be a potential conflict of interest.
Judy, I wonder if you could address the question that Bettina raised, which is the potential of what I'll term as a hybrid type of trial, where where the patients may actually be enrolled at a peripheral site, get much of their evaluation on peripheral side, but have to come to the central site maybe for specialized imaging or cardiovascular investigation. And how do you manage that? And whether that's something that we should be actually advocating for to allow us to expand into underserved communities.
Yeah, so I've been helping cardiology actually open trials at Mount Sinai, Queens, and that's a big trip for individuals to go, and you know, if they're taking you know, mass transit, it would take them over an hour to get to Mount Sinai Hospital. And so for those studies that they absolutely have to have at Mount Sinai Hospital, we have negotiated the travel costs, and in fact we even get Ubers for participants. You know, sometimes people say they don't want them. You have to be cautious, or they want to be picked up elsewhere, because, you know, we used to tell people to get a taxi, but they said if they went in a taxi, the neighbors were like, why were you in a taxi? You know, what's going on? But if you have an Uber pick them up, then that's even more, you know, whatever. So you might have to meet them on the corner or at their church or someplace else, but that seems to work. And I will say that for the most part, most sponsors are really willing to pay that additional cost to retain them in studies. The opposite thing that we have happening is that individuals will consent to a trial to get a procedure. So get a new type of implant or, you know, some device, and then they can have their follow-up visits elsewhere. And that seems to work a little bit better, and for the most part, they don't need to come back. One of the other big gaps we had was the emergency room. Emergency medicine has really some pretty intensive trauma type studies and various things, and our child psychiatry is all the way on the Upper West Side. And so the emergency room would consent, the parents get these kids in, but then they didn't have a place to go for their follow-ups. And so they were trying other places, and hence that's one of the reasons now we're going to be building that space on the West Side so that we can actually capture the emergency room enrollments and be able to see them for them.
Chris?
I have a question about workforce development, and I was intrigued a bit when you talked about having junior investigators take on some of these trials. They're so complicated now. What is the training we should be giving our residents, or to have people who are fully dedicated toward clinical trials, especially in the industry-sponsored space?
Yeah, I think it's really challenging for residents with their schedules to do. Bill can tell you that when I was a fellow, I said I wanted to do the AIDS clinical trials group, and he said, nobody does that for career development. And I said, well, that's what I want to do. And you know, I really learned, because there's two of them right here, Mike Cleavert and Kim, who you know, were in the unit, and then I followed them, and I got to learn everybody's skills. I do that with my own fellows, and you know, I think for a lot of the medicine subspecialties during their research year will engage the fellows into them. The residents are a little bit trickier because they're here and there and they're going all over, and I think it would depend on your system whether or not, you know, the residents can really participate in clinical trial. Sometimes they come to me and they think that they can just do a clinical trial within a year and it's done, and it's like, no, it's not that easy. One of the things that you can start doing is almost doing CRA training, though, with them. And we do that for people that we hire that have no research experience. And so, you know, teaching them the basics of, you know, and more than just what you may be using, like City Tutorial for your, you know, your human subjects research and all. So yeah, everybody do that, but then have more intensive training courses. And this is something that at Mount Sinai, the CTSA does support. And so, you know, I think it's a great tool as a way to teach your again, residents, fellows, medical students even, you know, what's involved in a clinical trial. What are the phases of a clinical trial, right? Some very basic can be done, which will at least start that engagement.
So just to follow up on that, we do support it's a 5-module, 5 evenings, basic training on being an investigator on a clinical trial goes through the regulatory requirements, goes through all of the issues that you need. There's been some debate, not here and elsewhere, about whether people who become clinical trialists actually should have some sort of mandated training before they actually enroll patients. What's your perspective on, because there has been this, see one, do one, learn, teach one approach, yet increasingly, both from a regulatory perspective and from really the complexity of clinical trials, you really need people who actually understand and recognize what is involved. And should we advocate for at least some core competency before you're ever allowed to become a PI?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm a little mixed about that, and I'll tell you, part of it's from my own experience with COVID is, I think back now, I'm surprised more of them didn't get COVID, but I took my fellows around and they went with me to consent patients, and it was really kind of sweet in some ways, but my fellows were so worried about me being exposed all the time. They didn't want me going in the rooms. They're like, you stay outside on the phone, I'll go in and get the signature, But it was that one-on-one training so that they really got to see very intensive. I mean, that was a time period that I hope we never go through again. But now take that away, and now I'm training new fellows, and I think, having them observe for a period of time before they actually do it, and when they do consent for their first times, is having them observed with another investigator that's more senior. But it does take time. I mean, I can tell you, from the COVID times, and now one of the medical director for the COVID CTU, somebody with an MD, PhD, was doing very basic science, working on a universal flu vaccine, and COVID hit, and he wanted to join me. And within a short period of time, we put hundreds of patients on trials, and we did the convalescent plasma, which was an EUA, and expanded access, and we put, over 1,000 people in that. And so he got so much experience that, in a very short time, it's been 3 years, there's nothing he can't do. But that's never going to happen, I hope, again. But I think in the meantime, I like for the fellows during their second year to at least be able to come over and spend a good portion, and we call them, like, hey, we have somebody, this is for screening, this one's going to be for consenting. They're not an investigator yet on the protocol.
I want to, since Clay is still in the audience, I want to ask him to comment on something, and then I'd like to perhaps have some of the panel respond. Judy touched on it, and she presented it, on the morbidity with COVID was seen disproportionately, particularly early in the epidemic, in communities that were underserved, and the hospitals were not necessarily part of academic research at that time. And specifically bringing it back to St. Louis, we saw early on the same trend with very significant admission rates and morbidity and mortality at Christian Hospital, which serves largely the north side of the city and county. And we wanted to actually bring clinical research in COVID there. We wanted to be able to do those, the trials that were here at Christian. And a number of people in this room will know that that was unsuccessful for different reasons. And so Clay was the chief clinical officer for BJC at the time. He and I had discussed it in great detail. And I'm wondering, Clay, if we had to do it again, what would you think we should have had in place at a place like Christian to allow us to actually enroll patients or offer patients the opportunity to participate in clinical trials?
I was impressed as Judy went through the development of her network-wide research program, at the sweat equity that was involved in getting all the sites, all, sort of working piece by piece. I was thinking of the old Peter Singh work on the fifth discipline about what's a restriction to a system, what keeps a system from flourishing, and how you have to pick at the thing that's the most challenging problem, and you solve that one, and then the next barrier comes into play. So I don't know that there's a substitute for all the pre-work we need to do now in anticipation of the next time. And to some extent, you took advantage of some historical accidents in terms of the way things stacked up, but we just didn't have that. Certainly as a system, we had never had to do that. And then even as a community, I think we had barriers that we just weren't prepared to overcome. It was a bitter disappointment to watch this epidemic sweep through the north side of St. Louis City and County, and with a devastating impact, and be unable to marshal the resources to get people to participate in trials to try to find ways to mitigate what was happening. And I don't think we'll get there in an emergency footing. I just don't think there's the level of trust. So what do we need? We need both the infrastructure, which is got to be scalable, back to the first talk of today, and we need the community relationships and the trust in what we're doing to enable us to move forward.
And, I mean, Rachel's in the audience, and I'll ask her to comment on this as well, because there are two things that there's the element of trust is an interesting one, and Bettina, I'd like your perspective on this as well. What we found in enrolling patients in the active trials here at this medical center was that there was no evidence whatsoever that our enrollment in different communities differed. In fact, we had the same rates of acceptance and enrollment right across communities. And in the vaccine trials, by engaging through the CTSA with the Community Advisory Board, we actually also had substantive enrollment in the trials. But ironically, the rollout of the vaccine itself in the community was not equitable, and that created challenges. So I'm just wondering whether some of the infrastructure that Clay talks about is actually really proactively working on increasing awareness of the value of clinical research. I don't think, and then putting into place the structures that allow people who don't have the same economic access the opportunity to participate in trials. So Rachel, I don't know if you'd like to comment on the experience during COVID.
Oh, I think I suppressed a lot of things because I'd forgotten the whole issue with Christian. But although that was a very, very difficult sort of thing to try to get done. I guess what I've found is a lot of mistrust can actually be overcome, but it's a lot of boots on the ground, and it's a lot of individual communication with people you trust. And so, I think some of the most successful things, and I'm sure Bettina can actually comment better than I, we're outreach to local religious organizations and churches, and as well as people talking to their individual doctors, and so trying to actually make sure you have that sort of ongoing, and I think the biggest thing that we need to be really careful about now actually is letting that drop, because I think we tried to get that set up and during COVID, and then and now there's not an emergency, and there's not, and so keeping that push going, I think, is really, really important to make sure that because the reason the community doesn't trust us is because they do think we come when we need them, and then we don't actually give anything back and continue. So.
Yeah, I agree with your comments. I think it's a two-pronged approach. I like to think of kind of the general community education on clinical trials. Clinical trials are always evolving. That means we need to continuously be talking about clinical trials and what that means for participants in clinical trials to community members. So if more and more clinical trials have options for at-home collections or going to your primary care provider for interim appointments, things like that that could make it better. That's part of that ongoing education so that people have a perspective of clinical trials when they are approached. I think the second half of that is educating the recruiters for clinical trials and the PIs, not just on cultural competency, but how to talk to individuals about clinical trials, what is on the consent form, how do you talk to people about the consent form, and that whole process. There could be things we found in some of our focus groups as the title of a study. You know, sometimes our titles are very technical and could be scary. There was one study that the title had genetic and risk profiling in the title, and both genetic and risk profiling could mean completely different things out of context, but for basic scientists and other researchers, it seems very common. So just thinking about things like that, how the study is presented. So there is a level of training that I think should be provided to those individuals who are doing the recruitment, as well as the PIs, as well as our IRB, right? So that when people looking at the 10-page sometimes consent forms, we can have smaller, more patient-friendly add-ons that could help explain the study to participants.
I'll add to this as well. I think that one of the issues, and Rachel may be suppressing this part, especially at Christian, is the lack of boots on the ground support at Christian itself. So I think that I'm actually very interested in how Mount Sinai does this at your farther outflung hospital facilities to enable the recruitment and treatment of those patients at those hospitals.
Yeah, so again, I mean, I'm fortunate because the hospital presidents and the CMOs were behind this, because everybody agreed there's health disparities, and especially Brooklyn and Queens, again, what they went through with COVID. So there was kind of like this open arms, but recognizing this is what we want, right? And so some of it's negotiation. We got a really lovely area to renovate in Brooklyn, at Mount Sinai, Brooklyn, because they wanted to build a surgical outpatient area. And so we went in, and the dean actually gave us money to renovate this space so that we could enroll the Janssen vaccine trial. And then when we're done, then it was handed over, and now they're using it for surgery. So when we had to have our follow-up visits, then we were given other space, though, because so it's looked like a partnership, right? It's like we're not just coming in to do clinical trials in your area. We're gonna help you. The other big community in Brooklyn was the Orthodox Jewish community, who was very hard hit with COVID. And this is one of the frustrating things where you think you make a lot of headway and then now you kind of get a setback. But they were very engaged with convalescent plasma, and we seriously would come in on buses to be able to donate we created a donation center so that we could then process the plasma. And we got into the whole vaccine issue, and what we learned was that there was nothing in the Orthodox Jewish faith that prevented them to get vaccinated, but this fixed belief by the mothers that their kids would get autism, they may get, side effects. So that was the stop point. So we actually had a webinar. One of the webinars, it was unbelievable. We had over 5,500 individuals on a webinar that listened to a core group of us talk about the vaccines and the safeties. And the rabbis actually themselves said, you can get vaccinated. So when the rabbis said that it was okay to be vaccinated, we really, that's why we went to Brooklyn then and opened up the Janssen vaccine study there. Unfortunately, not the vaccine to use, but we had really good enrollment, and we had consents in Hebrew when we did the Regeneron monoclonal antibody studies. The Jewish community was very active in enrollment, and so we made a lot of headway. Unfortunately, as you know, there's been this scare of a polio resurgence, and and the vaccination rate in the Orthodox Jewish community has fallen down to about 60%. So we're like right back with the Jewish moms going, but wait, you just, you finally agreed to COVID, but now all of a sudden it's polio and you're saying no. So, this is where that continual education, so we're back again, and this time we're not doing a study, but we're trying to do public health messaging about accepting vaccines and working with them. But I think, everything that we've done pretty much, and we too have gone to the Black churches and Hispanic communities, and we talk about Tuskegee up front, very, very much about the misinformation that's out there about that. We talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, which gets confused somehow with the syphilis, and there are two separate incidents, and so we explain that. The other thing that we did is we've gone out to the low-income housing, like during COVID and initially, to give out masks. And people were like, well, what do you want? And we're like, we don't want anything. We want you to learn how to wash your hands and wear a mask and, things like that. And so that's how you build trust, is by just being there to help and give public health messages.
So, Ginger, it's been touched on before, but I'd like your insight into this. I mean, in some ways, moving to a more remote or mobile technology can improve access, but there's also a fear that it will worsen equity. And I'm wondering whether you could give people some thoughts about how we balance that, and how we ensure that we don't lose sight of equity as we develop technology.
That's a great question, and I think, when we first started 5 years or more ago, it really, the equity issue was having a device, having access to a device. That's not really as big of an issue now as it is more so connectivity. So having internet access really seems to be the determinant. And then living in areas where cell phones, there might not be a lot of towers, some of the rural areas, especially in southern Missouri. So paying for data plans became part of our approach. And the thing that I think is evolved even more now is what sort of things can you budget for preemptively? So, losing access to a provider that provides services or devices, how do you budget to start again and get new things to the hands of the potential participants so they can participate? I think that's probably been our biggest issue. But then in addition to that, understanding how to use the technology. And so especially in some severely mentally ill populations and in older adults, we've had to do some training before, or testing out to see if people knew enough about how to operate basic functions on their devices to participate.
How about home health services? Are you able to get home health organizations to go out to the rural community? That's
a really excellent point. I mean, we've definitely interacted with organizations that is what they do. And for, the COVID study that we did, there were, conversations about how can we get, boots on the ground in those locations and what organizations are doing that sort of work. I know that that's part of, the services that are part of under the hospital systems umbrella here. And to the extent that that can be integrated, I think it probably is a bigger question that, institutionally we have to think about. How does Sinai do that?
Well, we had internal ones that were better. I will tell you, from some of the industry-sponsored vendors, they were out a window. Sometimes people didn't show up. They have mileage of how far they would go. And, we had people, like for the monoclonal antibodies, as far north as Buffalo, wanting to participate. And it's like, I can't provide care to you there. It's like, and their closest hospitals were not chosen as sites, and so there was a huge gap for those communities. We actually wound up sometimes having our own nurses go out and drive up to wherever they were so that we didn't lose people, but more so concerned about swabs and stuff. But that's where we learned people could do their own swabs and get the mailers and send them right directly to wherever they needed to go. But, you know, blood work requires, you know, it's hard to do your own blood work. So, you know, but that's where the dried blood spots came up about, there are other things that you could do. And there are some companies now that are doing more like finger stick, you know, capillary collection. That it makes me a little nervous on how well that's going to be done. But
So, Judy, you touched on something that I think would be of tremendous interest here, which was the increased participation in clinical departments in becoming coordinating centers for clinical trials. What's the magic sauce?
You tell me. So, you know, as you know, there's one person in particular at Sinai that has, you know, many years of experience as serving as a coordinating center. What we did is, one was that people didn't realize these were available, that they could apply. So one was really an awareness, and again, with the CTSA and the Institute's support, they held seminars and talk about, you know, who in your department, who in your division, what do you have? And then, again, it takes a lot of resources to serve as a coordinating center.
Yeah.
You know, doing the contracts is challenging. When I was at NYU, Judy Hockman, who's a cardiologist, launched a very large trial looking at stents versus conventional medication management, essentially. And it wasn't that they were providing meds or anything, but, you know, to launch a trial like that, to be able to do all the contracting, I mean, you need a lot of workforce. I mean, you need people who's doing all those electronic, you know, CRFs, and then where are they going back to, who's analyzing the data. And so being able to do that requires tremendous resources, and I think that's why many times people collaborate and they link with some of these commercial enterprises that are actually who's doing it. But, you know, if you're going to be a coordinating center, what exactly is involved in that coordinating center? Are you the one that's setting up the contracts and getting the contracts and then making sure that you're doing all the training for those sites to be up and running? But then, you know, are you also responsible for the data collection and that part? So I think it depends on how much of that you're really involved in. You know, the basic coordinating centers, for the most part, are doing the contracts, assisting with the regulatory, and then, you know, the launching of the trial, and making sure people are properly trained, et cetera.
Okay, we have Thomas. We have a couple of minutes left, so if you have if you have an urgent question, please put your hand up.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the use of the EHR. You talked about use of MyChart, and so we're one of those institutions where I want to say we're at the forefront of some of these things, where we've done a lot of things in terms of using the EHR as a medium for identifying patients, not just for clinical trials, but you know, one of the successful things that we did was we did a digital all of us recruitment, and it was hugely successful. Several people in this room were involved. One of the challenges that I've noticed over the period of time with using MyChart and these sort of things is that there's a significant bias, right? Like, who uses MyChart? There's young, healthy people or older white women, right? Like, so you find both of these extremes. And the second part of that problem is that the response rate for these sort of recruitments are less than 5%. Right, like the sort of large, sort of, you send 200,000, you can easily access these people, but the response rate's really low. So have you implemented any sort of filtering mechanisms or any sort of advances on this side of using these sort of digital recruitment tools, or be very interested to hear a perspective?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's bias, but there's bias in every population, right? Before, you were just choosing individuals out of your clinic, and it was the ones that your colleagues were saying, oh yeah, I think this person will be good, right? And so you had that bias, and this, at least, to me, it's a much broader reach. I think it depends on how well, too, this institution is approaching patients to enroll in MyChart. You know, like I can tell you in our HIV clinics, we work with our, you know, patients to enroll so that, because we want them to have their labs, right? So that does give that. And then the people that don't have phones, like I said, we still use from what was with President Obama, the Obama phones, as everybody calls them. So getting that available so that they can at least look at their laboratories. But no matter what system you use, these electronic systems, there's another one that's Build Clinica. Have you heard of them? So Build Clinica does the same thing, and it pushes out on like Instagram and all this stuff. And you know, you have to be cautious. I mean, what we've found is that sometimes you'll get really good results. Other times you wind up getting the people that are really just looking for money for in these trials, you know, and they might not even have the condition. You know, you bring them in and they say yes, yes, and yes, and then you bring them in and then you find out they have like major exclusion criteria. So you have to be cautious because it does consume a lot of time doing them. We're just in the early launch of using, you know, MyChart, and like I said, it really worked well for Recover because every single person that had a positive test received the same thing, and so it's, you know, I can't remember what number we're up to, but we're pretty high in the numbers of individuals that have said yes. And we do take a look at demographics all the time. Pfizer actually had offered us their system, and we were very much focused on enrollment of minorities only, and yet Pfizer would not screen by race or ethnicity, and every person that used Pfizer was white. So it was like, we told them, we don't want to use your system anymore because you're not reaching out to the population that we're trying to reach. But I don't know the answer to your question on the broader scope. Is there ways, metrics, or other things that you can measure to be able to see if you can really recruit the population you want through that mechanism?
So I'm going to wrap up. I first of all want to thank all of the panelists. I want to thank Judy for coming here and really giving us her insights, which I think we'll learn a lot from, and the panelists for participating in this discussion. For younger investigators who are interested in clinical trials, I just want to point out that many of the resources to help you learn about the trials, to recruit participation, to help you, if it's an investigator-initiated trial, to help you design that trial, are available through the ICTS, and I would encourage you to visit the website to get more information. One of the things I do want to highlight, because it came out of COVID and it addresses something that we discussed today, is our community advisory board, which was very helpful in us thinking about maintaining and increasing diversity of enrollment, has now instituted a program that they will help individual investigators create their own community advisory board for their trial and for their investigation. And they feel very strongly, and I agree, that if you are starting a trial, you should have a community advisory board. And this may be whether it's in cardio, and ideally a community advisory board that has some knowledge of the condition that you're actually trying to enroll patients to. And our CAB, I think, is one of the leaders in thinking about this across the CTSA network and thinking about how this could actually be rolled out so that they will not only advise the investigator, but they will also help train the CAB to learn how to be an effective CAB for a specific trial or a specific investigative group. So do avail of those sort of resources because they are critical in terms of helping enroll not only patients who have the condition you're interested in, but also a diverse patient population. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank everybody for their attendance. I think this has been a wonderful learning experience. And please visit the posters at the break. You know, we have young people who've done the work. It's always encouraging if they get an opportunity to explain their work to you. And there's lunch available. Thanks very much.